What I found is I definitely have a deep faith, a strong belief in the divine and in God, and that's been such an important part of my life and recovery because it allows me to frame things in a way that I see that it's part of the title Unexpected. When I'm looking for something beautiful in the midst of suffering and difficulty and knowing there's meaning and purpose even in the most difficult parts of life, that to me is part of the faith and part of the belief that something better is available on the other side of this. Everyone listening, you guys all have suffering, difficulties. I am not unique in this. And we've all been through difficult times. And in the midst of them, it sucks. It's not fun. I don't wish it on my worst enemies. But if we can have a framework, a mindset of looking for the lesson, the teaching, and the way to transform our bodies, minds, and souls in the journey, it changes everything. I know now, part of resilience is that I know I've been through a lot, and I hope I don't have to go through a lot more. But if I do, I now know there's nothing that could come against me that I couldn't figure out or overcome.
Dr. Jill, welcome to the Superhuman Life.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here, Frank.
I am so excited too. Obviously, we joked about it before hitting record here. We've had to jump through some hurdles. And what I found in 183 episodes now, the ones that take a little bit of work to get on are the ones that always turn out to be the best episodes. So I know just based upon you, your background, your experience, that today is going to be an incredible conversation. So really honored and grateful to have you here.
Thank you. Super excited.
Yeah, I think where I want to start. So, I have a background in health and fitness. I did bodybuilding, and obviously, the vast majority of people understand how powerful a diet can be for a physical transformation. But in 2019, some experiences took place in my life, set me down this journey, and now I look at obviously health, nutrition, completely different lens. It's a big part of the work that we do in addiction recovery. So, curious with you. Was there a specific point in your life where you really got crystal clear on how powerful the gut health, the nutrition in our diet is, not just for the way we physically look, but the way that we feel inside and actually our ability to heal ourselves?
Wow. Yes, I have a lot to tell about that. So I grew up on a farm in central Illinois, and my mother was a retired nurse raising 5 children. So we always grew up with we had a huge, like probably half-acre garden. So I like grew up, like in the garden, pulling peas and digging potatoes and eating strawberries. And so that was a very normal part of my life that we grew part of our food. My mother like froze and canned and did all kinds of stuff. So we'd have food through the winter and we, grocery shop like anyone else and all that kind of stuff and went to the doctor. But I definitely grew up with a mindset that food was powerful and that growing your own food was powerful and that the nutrients we ate were powerful. And so this was a concept I wasn't unfamiliar with. But there was certainly lessons that took it to a whole new level. Part of my journey is at 25 years old, in the midst of medical school, I was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. And I remember, prior to that, at 14 years old, I grew up on a farm, so it was kind of like steak and potatoes, granted, we had fresh food and stuff too, but it was a very kind of hearty Midwestern diet. And I knew that I didn't love meat. Like now looking back, I probably had low stomach acid and zinc deficiency and some other things going on. So at 14, I decided to become a vegetarian. But at 14, with no really background in that, I really didn't know how to be a healthy vegetarian. And I always joke I was more of a carbitarian. And I joke because at 25, when I got diagnosed with breast cancer, I realized the diet I had had since I'd been 14, the previous 10 years, it was killing me. Like it was way too high in carbohydrates and refined sugars. I, was addicted to sugar and sweet things. And I was eating, unbeknownst to me, lots of refined carbs that contained gluten. And part of my story is I was undiagnosed celiac. I didn't know that I had an issue with gluten. So the food really, really, really mattered to my health. And at 25, when I got the diagnosis of breast cancer, part of my journey was like, why did I get this? What happened? Well, part of the journey was the toxic chemicals on the farm and the exposure to some of the pesticides and atrazine and those things I think contributed to my risk of cancer. But part of it was my diet, which unbeknownst to me, I thought I was being really healthy, was not good for me at all because I was eating a lot of gluten. I was eating processed soy. I was eating a lot of carbs, and that was the wrong thing for my gut. I started to transition and change foods then. But 6 months after I finished aggressive chemotherapy for my breast cancer and radiation and surgery, I was considered cured of breast cancer. I was bald and malnourished and quite sick from the therapy, went right back into my rotations. And 6 months after I was finished with that treatment, I was in the ER taking a patient's blood pressure, and I literally passed out. I'd been having cyclical fevers and pain and abdominal issues, just ignored it, pushed right through. And I woke up the next day. I'd had surgery for an abscess, an emergency surgery. I was admitted that night to the hospital. And the doctor came in after my surgery and said, Jill, I don't know, how to tell you this, but you have Crohn's disease. So Crohn's disease is a gut immune issue where your body's immune system attacks the gut lining. It's an autoimmune disease, another life-threatening illness. And I was like, what in the world? How did this happen? And to your point about food, I remember seeing the gastroenterologist after my diagnosis, kind of to check in. He's like, Jill, you're going to have this lifelong. You're going to probably need drugs the rest of your life, immune modulating drugs. You may have to have part of your colon removed, and it's considered incurable. I was like, whoa. And I remember leaving, and my last question to the gastroenterologist was, doc, I want to play my part. I want to do what I can. Does diet have anything to do with this? He did not pause. He just said, Jill, diet has nothing to do with this. Now, this was 20 years ago. Now we know better. And I intuitively knew better. I was like, that can't be right. And I went on my own journey to prove him wrong. I basically fired him and I was like, that can't be right. I went on my journey and I found specific carbohydrate diet. I changed my diet. I was no longer a vegetarian. And that diet, within 2 weeks of changing my diet after the Crohn's diagnosis, my fevers went away, my symptoms improved. I wasn't considered cured of Crohn's. It took many years to fix the microbiome. But that was enough between the cancer diagnosis and the Crohn's to really start to understand food absolutely plays a role in health and disease and in recovery from these illnesses.
Yeah, what an incredible, I mean, just first 25 years, right? For you, it's like, God, here's this, amazing life. We're living on a farm. And then by 25, breast cancer, we overcome that. And then a few years later, it's like, now we're hit with this other thing. And the fact that you've been able to navigate all this and it's become such a massive part of your work. What percentage, I mean, I don't even know if this is like, if there would be data on this, what percentage of autoimmune is nutrition related? I mean, I guess the question is like, are you like, are certain people maybe born with an autoimmune disease? Or is it more they're born with a tendency to lean towards that? And then it's going to be food, environment. You understand
I
the question?
understand exactly what you're saying, and I have a really clear answer. So,
Okay.
some of the work, Dr. Vojjani and others 20 years ago showed that there's a triad that's common to all autoimmunity. And when you understand this, I could literally have someone walk into my office with some rare autoimmune disease that I've never seen before, and I'd still know exactly how to treat it, exactly where to go. And part of it is environment and food, and we'll talk about that. First thing is genetics. So there is a genetic predisposition for people to have more proneness to this self-attack, so the body's immune system attacking self. For me, I had a gene called NOD2, which makes me a very high risk for Crohn's disease. And so unbeknownst to me, when that chemotherapy, one of the drugs called Cytoxan actually induces leaky gut or intestinal permeability. And I didn't really know that, but that caused massive damage on my gut lining. And then I had that underlying genetic predisposition. So all of a sudden, the dumping of the bacterial products in my gut lumen into the bloodstream, into the immune system, for me was enough of a trigger to start the cascade of the development of Crohn's disease. So that first thing, genetics. Now, also unbeknownst to me, I had the high risk gene for celiac. So like I said, I was on this totally wrong diet for me because it was high gluten, high carb, worst thing a celiac person could be eating. And I think that was one of the other things that was causing inflammation under the hood of the car before I got diagnosed with Crohn's. But back to the triads, we have that genetic piece, which I certainly had some risk factors, and most people who get autoimmunity have some sort of genetic risk factor. The other part of the triad is, one is environmental triggers. This could be things like chemicals, toxins, mold. It could be, food. So if someone has a really bad corn allergy or celiac that's silent, gluten could be a trigger for autoimmunity, as it was in my case. And then the third tier of the triad is the gut immune interface. So it's like Vegas. What happens in the gut stays in the gut, except it doesn't. It's the opposite. What happens on that gut? So basically, our lumen, the gut tube from mouth to anus, basically has an interface. It's our external interface with the environment. It's where our food comes in and the things that we ingest come in. And there's only one cell layer between the gut lumen and the bloodstream. And that's because we need to transport nutrients back and forth. But what can happen is when we have some barrier insult from toxic mold, from chemicals exposure, from me for chemotherapy, or from gluten for me as well, these barriers are impaired, and we call it leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability. This is ground zero for autoimmune disease, which means every autoimmune disease has some interface with the gut and the play of that environment or foods, as you mentioned, as triggers, or it could be microbes. And those triggers cross over into the bloodstream and start to trigger this immune cascade that can end up an attack of your thyroid, like Hashimoto's, or in your nerves, like multiple sclerosis, or in your joints, like rheumatoid arthritis. So, like I said, if I know it doesn't matter if it's an autoimmune disease that's incredibly uncommon or rare, they all have this commonality of genetics, environmental triggers, and the gut immune interface. And therefore, they all have a commonality that food could influence how they manifest.
I mean, that genetic piece, I mean, it's obviously not something that is inside of your control. I mean, the environments at a young age really not as well. I'm curious. So I had Dr. Mahmoud Ghanem on. This was like a year and a half. So he's a gut specialist. Discovered the microbiome, and we got into, we were discussing, this was right around towards the second half of COVID, and we were talking about immunity, health preventative things with children. He gave us a couple steps in terms of like raising the strongest immune system for a child, right? Natural birth, passing through the birth canal, not a C-section. But then he talked about farms and being around animals. Now, you mentioned you grew up on a farm, so it seems like that would have been a perfect environment for you. Was it now based upon your genetics from the childhood that is why what led you to getting the breast cancer first? I mean, the fact that you were on the farm, you would think that would have been the right type of environment.
So I love this question because again, I grew up with a big family, lots of love, support, beautiful parents. So all that was wonderful. And this farm, we had acres to roam and play on four-wheelers and play with snowmobiles and like run around. And we had cats and dogs. And so lots of beautiful things. And like you mentioned, children who interact with the dirt, who like play in the garden like I did growing up. I literally, part of my chores were to go out and pick peas and to, play in I'd pull them off the vine and then eat them. And they of course had little dirt. That when a child gets exposed to the dirt in the environment, the dirt in the soil in small amounts, especially through like garden food that's not chemically treated with pesticides and stuff, those things actually train up a young immune system to be healthy. So we actually have a much bigger problem for a child today that from 0 to 2 is in a sterile environment with hand sanitizer every single day. That's going to be a much weaker immune system because they have no interaction to train their immune system to what is friendly and what is foe by interacting with dirt and animals. So what you said on one side is I had this wonderful, wonderful exposure to an amazing environment. But on the other side of that, we had corn and soybeans that were sprayed with pesticides and herbicides. And again, back in the 70s and 80s, they didn't really know any better. My dad was just doing what every other farmer did. Nowadays, I can say because of my breast cancer, because of what I've been through, my family's farm, which my brothers still farm, is 100% non-GMO and partially organic, which is almost unheard of in Central Illinois corn and soybean farms. So they've really done some massive transition, partially due to my own cancer experience. But why could that happen? Well, there were still chemicals and we had well water. And for me, I was probably born genetically I know I was born with some genetic impairments and detoxification. So what happens is I always describe toxicity as the ability to detox is like the bucket that we're born with. And as that bucket fills with water over our lifetime, the toxic exposures, at some point it starts to reach the top and spill over. And it typically will present with cancer, with autoimmunity, and with neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or things like that. So often when that toxic load becomes full in the bucket, we spill over into disease. And mine happened to happen very young at 25 with both cancer and autoimmune disease, which means my toxic load was probably heavy, probably from birth, because my mother in utero, I'm sure she had some exposures on the farm and she had a few health issues of her own. And then I was breastfed and was vaginal birth. And as you mentioned, those are good things. So it's kind of like which good things and which bad things played into this. But I think some of those exposures on the farm to chemicals and toxins were part of my story of getting the cancer. And then the genetic piece was that I had some impairments in detoxability just genetically from birth.
Yeah. Oh no, thank you for sharing that. Now you had mentioned that you had gone vegan, but really it's like you kind of went super high carb. How much of the carbohydrates led to the cancer? I mean, like I know we can't point to a clear percentage, but was that a massive part? I mean, obviously we know cancer cells thrive and they live off of glucose. So for me, I've utilized the carnivore diet. I'm not like 100%, like I'm not, dogmatic about it. I think that there's some good things about it. I think that a lot of people can fall into a trap with being purely meat, but I know a lot of people have found success. And obviously the ketogenic diet, Dr. D'Agostino's research based out here in Moffitt, shown a lot of value with keto in cancer research as well. So how much of it was the carbs that led to it versus maybe some of the other environmental and the other exposures?
Great question. So I do believe that for me, one of the things that ended up, we know that glucose does feed cancer. And so certainly a high glucose diet is one of the worst things you can do for cancer. And again, I kind of gravitated towards more of a high carb diet. And part of it was I just was ignorant. I didn't know. I don't think that every vegetarian's unhealthy, but for me, it was absolutely not the right thing for my physiology. And what I'm most apt to tell people is plant-based is still huge, even if you're keto or more, like you still need plant foods. But you often, like for me, fish and chicken are an absolute part of my diet and finding that balance between the two of getting, and back in the day from 14 to 25, I didn't know any better. I wasn't eating very healthy and I was trying to, I just didn't know any better. So the glucose, yes. And then, part of Crohn's and colitis at the root, we check anti-Saccharomyces and anti-Candida antibodies because the inflammatory bowel disease, some of the panels that predict risk are literally anti-yeast antibodies. So unbeknownst to me, now I know better, but one of the things that was contributing to inflammation was number one, undiagnosed celiac. That whole celiac cascade and that genetics around celiac are very immune disruptive. So if your immune system isn't robust enough to fight the cancer cells that are starting to grow and divide, that was a player. Number two, higher carb, higher glucose, higher refined carbs, and higher processed, like processed soy products. Horrible for our health, but that's all I knew for meat substitutes when I was trying to do vegetarian. Wasn't good for me at all. And then number three, the carbohydrate antibodies show with Crohn's and colitis that yeast overgrowth, which is fueled by glucose and sugar, is also a part. So when I started to heal from Crohn's, which I did end up defying the doctor's advice that diet had nothing to do with it, I found a diet called, at that time, the specific carbohydrate diet, and that's been shown to help with Crohn's and colitis. And in my little limited knowledge, that's what I had to do. And it was something that completely reversed my symptoms. And over time, I kept modifying the diet, and I'm considered 20 years later, I don't have Crohn's. It's gone. I call it reversible autoimmunity. But at the time, I just was slowly introducing dietary things. And what it was shifting from glucose as a fuel source to healthy, plant-based, and things like fish and chicken. And I've never been able to do red meat. So for me, that's just a personal thing. I don't think that's bad for everybody. So I'm kind of free of red meat, but I absolutely do healthy, organically grown fish and chicken, wild fish especially, and grass-fed grazed chickens and that kind of thing. But lots of plants, lots of nuts and seeds, lots of fiber, all that good stuff together. And like you said, glucose, and it was contributing to an overgrowth in the gut. What we find at the core of a lot of Crohn's and colitis and even autoimmunity is SIBO and SIFO. SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And so in your small bowel, you shouldn't have a lot of bacteria. And when you have either trouble with breaking down food in your stomach from lack of digestive enzymes or lack of stomach acid or other impairments, you can have overgrowth of bacteria in the small bowel, and it can really cause damage to the absorptive surface. The absorptive surface is like shag carpet, those villi that line the gut. And when we damage them through celiac, through overgrowth of bacteria, through overgrowth of yeast or inflammatory bowel disease, this ruins the shag carpet. And then all of a sudden we have like hardwood floor. We have no absorptive surface. And that is long-term really damaging. So that's SIBO, but SIFO is small intestinal fungal overgrowth. Many doctors don't talk about this, don't know how to test it, but it's a huge factor in the development of Crohn's and colitis and even other types of IBS syndromes that people have where they have gut symptoms and they don't have a root cause.
Wow. What percentage of people have an autoimmune disease?
Yeah, this is big. There's like 1 in 4. It's first of all, it's the fourth leading cause of death in women. And especially what happens is, so that's huge. It's right after cardiovascular disease. And I don't know what the other top are, but, and by now I bet it's even gone higher than that, Frank, because COVID, one thing it does is activate B cells in some people. And we're seeing a lot of people with residual effects after having COVID. And one of those is new onset autoimmunity. It's a tsunami waiting to happen. Like all the time I'm seeing new diagnosed autoimmune. It's like our immune system got confused with all the craziness of the pandemic. And we're seeing a massive increase. And what happens is typically autoimmune disease is siloed. So we have the rheumatologist diagnoses rheumatoid arthritis, the neurologist diagnoses MS, the endocrinologist diagnoses Hashimoto's or other disorders. So all these silos are not really talking, but as a group, it's the same process, the same thing. It's not subject to the specialist. And as a group, it's one of the fastest growing causes of morbidity and mortality.
They said 1 in 4 women cause of death, or 1 in 4. It's the fourth leading cause of death in women. Does that mean that women are more susceptible to an autoimmune disease?
Yeah, so there is a genetic and hormonal component, as I mentioned, genetic, but then hormonal. Testosterone benefits men because they have more of it, and it actually can decrease autoimmune disease. In some of my own personal history, which I've had multiple autoimmune diseases, not just Crohn's, I used healthy physiological doses of testosterone as one mechanism to decrease my risk because women naturally have less testosterone, and testosterone tends to be less or more inhibitory on the autoimmune process, and it can be helpful to replace that in women.
Now, you also said that we're seeing a massive rise in like new people getting, obviously with the wave of the pandemic, we know what that did to autoimmune. Is there an age demographic? Like are kids, teenagers obviously going to be more susceptible? I mean, 20s, 30s, 40s, like how are they? And then I guess later in years, like at what age do you need to be kind of worried and concerned? And then I want to maybe kind of get into like maybe giving some people some things that they can look for, think about, and kind of do.
Oh, I love this. So first of all, ages. So What I've seen post-pandemic, and this was happening before, it's just because what we know. So let's go back to functional medicine basics 101. I always think about these complex chronic people that are coming to see me. They've been everywhere, they've tried to find answers, and my job is to be the best medical detective and go deep and find root cause. So I tend to get a lot of the people who've been to Stanford or Mayo Clinic or wherever, and they haven't found adequate answers to say, why is this happening to me? And autoimmune disease tends to be a big player in this. So the first thing I say is, at the core, there's often toxic load and infectious burden. And these two things play together to create immune dysfunction and inflammation. But almost always at the core of a new onset unexplained illness, including autoimmune disease, there's some toxic load, toxic exposure, and there's some infectious disease or infectious burden. And what that can be is like back, when you were 5, you got chickenpox. When you were 19, you got mononucleosis in college and you were tired with a sore throat. We all get these infections. We all get these viruses. And many of us grew up and got bit by spiders or ticks or other things that carried other illnesses like Bartonella, Borrelia, all these things. And many of us are walking along, we're just fine. So if I tested 1,000 people on the street for Lyme disease, for example, I might find 30% of them have had Lyme disease, but they're fine, which means there's some of these people that his immune system is so robust that the old chickenpox, the old viruses, the old Epstein-Barr, the old Lyme is kept under control because they have a robust immune system. And so that means not everybody needs to be treated all day long for these infections, but there is a risk. And you think about shingles as a great example. Shingles is chickenpox reactivated. You've all heard people who've had shingles, and probably even more so since, yeah, right? And since the pandemic. And all that is a reactivation of an old dormant virus that was sitting there, not bothering you, but for some reason your immune system wasn't able to keep it in check and it popped up. Same thing can happen with Lyme. Same thing can happen with Epstein-Barr and cause chronic fatigue or many, many other viruses. So often, back to the autoimmune picture, we have old viruses, old infections that if they pop their heads up, they can be a trigger to autoimmunity. They're one of those, when I talked about environmental triggers, infections are one of the things that can trigger someone into autoimmune disease. And I'm going to frame this in light of the pandemic because what we saw, for some reason, this virus, we've seen SARS viruses before, and they can be part of autoimmune. We've known this for years. Like what happened in the pandemic happened to a lot of people, so it became more prevalent, more common. But this stuff that was happening, I've seen for 20 years because I do functional medicine root cause. I've seen viruses cause illness and cause autoimmunity. But because so many people were affected by the virus and had the virus, since that time, we've seen a lot more B cell activation, which is an increase in autoimmune disease in the people who've had COVID. So it's just more prevalent because so many more people got affected by this virus. But this virus is not that different from the other viruses we've seen. And what you mentioned and what I'm mentioning is, because this virus weakens some of the T cell function, at least for a few months after you've gotten infected, we are often seeing shingles pop up in 20-somethings or 30-somethings, young people. We're seeing Epstein-Barr reoccur and chronic fatigue or sore throat. We're seeing Lyme disease or other infections. So part of what happened is that weakening of the immune system is causing old infections to be more prevalent. And your original question about age, average age of celiac, which is an autoimmune disease, is 55 years old. So often it takes many, many decades of the insult and the infections, the toxins to start to really take a person fully into autoimmune disease. So before I would say, start thinking in your 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe more so. But what's happening now is all of these things are happening to younger people. So the shift has become 20s and 30s are now presenting with autoimmune disease and with infections that are popping up.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that. The shingles one really hit home to me. So I had a bout of shingles. So it'd been the summer of 2009. So I was 25 years old at the time. Had chicken pox. I was a kid. I was playing in the dirt, drinking out of the hose on the side of the house. Like, I had broken bones and had a lot of injuries in my life. Nothing was as painful as living with shingles for the week and a half that I had it. And I know how I gave it to myself. I told you before I was a competitive bodybuilder. So my first contest prep, had no clue what I was doing. I went chicken and rice and broccoli for 16 weeks long, thinking about what I was going to eat the night of the show. I literally had it all planned out. I'm like, I'm going to eat a box of donuts. I'm going to drink 2 Mountain Dews. We're going to go to Applebee's. I'm going to get half price appetizers, like 6 appetizers, then a giant burger, got sick, couldn't even sit up straight, like had to drink Pepto-Bismol. 2 days later, like I'd put 40 pounds back on from inflammation. My body just wasn't adept to handle it, right? Like I'd just carrying all this excess load, had edema going up my legs where it was just massive swelling. 2 days later, I wake up with these patches on my back, up and down my spine, massive, massive pain. I'm like, what the hell is going on? Then they start like spreading and then they start peeling and getting flaky. Kind of find out it covered half of my body. Dr. Jill, the only time in my life I've had to call out from work was when I
Yeah.
had shingles as a 25-year-old. So
Wow, you
I've
so understand. And you just gave us a
100.
perfect story. You kind of went on this elimination diet and then like, okay, And that's back to your original point. Food has everything to do with our health, right? Like you
Yes.
just, and it's crazy because
Yes.
we think, oh, we're just going to cheat and do this, and you can decide if it's worth it. But like obviously for you, that wasn't worth it,
It
was
definitely was not worth
it?
it. Maybe a donut, maybe
Right,
maybe
right.
one appetizer. I don't think I needed 12 of them and six
Uh,
appetizers, but that's an immature, young man thinking that
right.
he's, can conquer the world. No, this is amazing. I want to take a slight, obviously, well, actually here, let's go here for a minute. Because we talked about, it's obviously rising, looking at it later in life, but it's becoming more prevalent. What are some things that people can maybe begin to look for and think about, like, hey, am I going down the path of getting myself autoimmune, and how early on is it recognizable, and how early on can people catch it, and what are some of the early signs that they should look for?
Ah, love this. So, unexplained fatigue, cognitive mental issues, those can be like really vague things, but they're common to a lot of the stuff we're dealing with. Most people, in fact, I have a friend who's like, oh, I'm just aging. I'm like, no. I mean, granted, we are all aging, that's true, but just because we have significant memory issues or fatigue where we have trouble getting out of bed some days, that is not good. That's not normal aging. I feel like I'm in better health at 46 years old than I've ever been in my 20s and 30s. Now, of course, I had cancer and Crohn's in my 20s and 30s, but I'm in better shape, better, more muscle, less body fat, better energy, better sleep than I am. And I know it's possible. And so what's true is I'm literally in way better shape in 40s than I was in 20s and 30s. And that is absolutely possible. So you don't want to excuse achy joints, brain fog, trouble sleeping, mood disorders, just for I'm just aging. You want to go to the root cause. And any good functional medicine doctor or integrative practitioner can help you get to the root. So what do you do? Well, some of the basics are start with your environment. I always say clean air, clean water, clean food. Sounds simple, but more than a bunch of expensive supplements, you can start with things that you can do right now. 80% of the air that we breathe is our toxic exposure. So 80% of the toxic exposure, I should say, is the air that we breathe. That was a shocking statistic when I first read that. And I realized the power of like air filtration, whether it's just a good furnace filter. I have standalone filters. I have 3 in my home and 5 at my workplace. So you want something with a good HEPA filtration system, which is going to filter out particulate matter like debris and spores and dirt and dust. But you also want something with a VOC filter, which is a volatile organic compound that's typically like zeolite or charcoal inside a filter. And that will literally filter out the 2.5 micron particulate and less, which is like formaldehyde or smoke or off-gassing or mycotoxins from mold or viruses. So these filters are really powerful, and our homes have become, first of all, they're more quickly built. So there's often, building defects, and I've even seen a lot more new homes that have mold issues because they're so put up so quickly with poor construction. But even if they're efficient, our efficiency of our building is also harming us because there's less air, exchange from the outside. And I always say dilution is the solution to pollution. So if you have a little bit of air exchange, say you even are living in a moldy home and you can't move, if you open your windows and get some outdoor air to dilute that effect, you're going to feel better. So these super efficient certified buildings can actually be more harm than good if they have some sort of off-gassing of cabinets, off-gassing of floors, off-gassing of granite countertops, or mold inside the home. And so that indoor air quality is huge. That's number one, clean air. Clean water, like it sounds, you can get a reverse osmosis system, you can get a countertop filter, a fridge filter, but filtered water is key, especially nowadays. Just last year in Colorado, they tested the water supply and found out literally 100% of the water tested had PFAOs, which are like Gore-Tex, Teflon, these water resistant materials. These are forever chemicals, which means they are going to be in our water supply forever. Scientists cannot even calculate the half-life, which means they're around. They are there permanently in our water supply. Now, filtration can take care of that, but just like I grew up on a farm with well water that probably had some contaminants, our water is huge. So clean air, clean water, clean food. And so no matter whether you're a paleo, keto, or you're vegetarian or anywhere in between, um, there is such a key on getting quality food and getting good nutrients from your food. The soils today are so depleted. In fact, I talk about this in the book, but I say, I used to say autoimmune disease begins in the gut because we just talked about where that starts. But I now go a step further and say, I think it starts in our soils because our soils reflect our microbiome. And as we use pesticides and herbicides and change the microbiome of the soil, we're actually growing plants that are depleted in nutrients. So even if you get a homegrown, local, organic, Brussels sprouts or some peppers, they're going to have less magnesium in them today than they did 100 years ago. So even if we're getting good, clean, organic food, or say we're buying organic food, but it has to be shipped from California, we're losing nutrient value for every hour that truck is on the road, and those plants are harvested and being held or being kept in cool. So the nutrient value of our food is diminishing because of the soil qualities. but clean air, clean water, clean food are kind of where you can start. And then you said, well, how could you know? Well, certainly if you have unexplained symptoms, but we can do predictive autoantibody testing. So in the book, I give a list of the top labs that someone should get before the age of 30. Some of those are basic metabolic panel and CBC, but some of those include anti-nuclear antibody and extractable nuclear antigen. And some of these things are actually, we can check in the blood. Anyone can do this. Any doctor can order this. We can check antibodies in the blood because if you feel fine, but you have an ANA that's positive, that means you are walking into the door. Your body has made antibodies to nuclear material in your cells. There's something going on there. And many rheumatologists will look at that and say, well, you seem fine. Let's just come back and check it in a year. As a functional medicine doctor, I'm like, red flag. That means something is already happening in the body where the immune system is starting to attack your own cells. We need to go further and look for environmental triggers and look at the gut and start to reverse that.
I love that so much. And for me, we do a lot of work with men in recovery. So I have a company that helps guys overcome pornography addiction. And a lot of them come like, how do I deal with, triggers and stress and all these urges? It's like, well, there's defensive strategies, right? And like, that's like kind of some of the filters, right? The purified water. How do we kind of defend ourselves, some of these things? But then he said, no, we need to get some of these like predictive tests or tests done. Like, and that's the offensive game that I'm thinking about, right? Like my brain just kind of thinks in sports analogies. So it's like, yeah, we have a great defense, but let's get in front of some of these things. And I love that whole approach there. I want to take a slight pivot here. This has been so incredible. I want to talk specifically about mold. It's come up here a few times, and that's really where I found you going back to 2019, I believe. So as I shared with you before, like mold toxicity hit very, very close to me. It was actually in a townhome that I was living. And I realized it was one of these townhomes that was built 2008, 2009. It was literally thrown up, like 20 homes built in the matter of like 3 months. Like it was just pieced together. And for me, I lived there for 3 years and I don't think it really affected me. And then I had somebody move in with me and she had RA. So she was diagnosed from early like childhood that she had rheumatoid arthritis. So she was living with an autoimmune disease. And some of my own ignorance, she walked in the door, she said, your house doesn't smell right. I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. So she knew it right out of the gate. And then she stayed there with me for 2.5 years. So I've put a lot of this on me and I've gone through my own healing because I felt really, really bad because what it ended up doing to her, it literally was at the point where she saw 13, 14 different doctors and none of them could tell us. And then finally we found a great functional medicine doctor, did the whole test. I scooped it up, like sent it off to the filter and we were out of the house in like 2 days once it was confirmed. So share a little bit about your journey with mold, because I know that came even later after conquering cancer, after curing yourself from Crohn's. Then you had to deal with mold. So tell us about that journey, and then let's kind of get into the dangers and around
Yeah.
mold toxicity.
Yeah, and how to tell. This is one of those things. Number one, it can be a huge trigger to autoimmune disease, like we just talked about. It's actually maybe one of the biggest triggers because it massively affects the gut and the immune system. But the bigger issue is there's probably people walking around that have this new onset cognitive decline, like brain fog, memory issues, focus, concentration issues, mood disorders, sleep issues, depression, anxiety, even bipolar schizophrenia. So even the extreme cases of mood and mental issues, or new onset autoimmune, joint pain, fatigue, gut issues, heartburn. And I could go on and on and on the list of things that mold can do. And they go to their doctor and the doctor says, oh, you have IBS, or oh, you have depression. Here's an antidepressant. Or oh, you have rheumatoid arthritis. Here's a methotrexate, a heavy duty drug to calm that inflammation. So what happens is we are treating the symptoms and the doctors are doing their job. They're giving the label, they're giving a treatment according to conventional medicine, but they're not saying, why did this happen? You're 36, you shouldn't have those symptoms. Or you're even, 45, you shouldn't have those symptoms. So the question why is always the important part. And what I find is there's so many people that are exposed to mold that don't even know it, that are sick from that. Now you explained something really interesting and very relevant, and that's that you didn't have much symptoms. So one in four, about 25% of our population, I'm one of them, sounds like your partner was one of them at the time too, that basically we don't tag and get rid of those toxins from mold very easily. So we're more likely to have an immune activation and get really, really sick from the mold, whereas our partner or our friends or our family can't even tell or can't even smell it. So it's real common to have a whole household where there's one or two that are incredibly sick and affected, and many other people in the same environment are doing okay. They might have a little sniffle, a little congestion, maybe a little cough, nothing big, and definitely not autoimmune symptoms, but they're very different. So this is partially genetic, and that is basically our ability to tag and get rid of these toxins that we're exposed to. And I'm one of those that is very sensitive as well. So my story, I was doing wonderful after the cancer, the Crohn's, got through medical school, started a integrative clinic in Illinois, and then moved to Colorado to start my own functional consulting practice. I was running marathons, hiking, skiing, doing all the fun things I loved. And I started going downhill. I started having shortness of breath, joint pain, fatigue, skin rashes, acne, just all kinds of things that were not going well. I had an office on the second floor, and so I'd walk up, I'd get the patient in the lobby, and then walk up the stairs with them. And I started not being able to carry on a conversation up 2 flights of stairs with my patient. Like I was running, I was active. What in the world? And I ended up doing testing in the basement of my office building, and I found black toxic mold. And around the same time, I did a urine test that showed I had mycotoxin exposure in my body. And the type of mycotoxins was from that black toxic mold. It's called trichocythenes, which is really nasty black toxic mold. And this toxin is literally known to be immunosuppressive, neurologically toxin. I mean, it's a toxin all over the body. So that was my wake up call. And it happened a year after the Boulder flood. There was a massive flood in Boulder. And so that water damage to my office kind of exacerbated an already going problem. So 2014, found out there was a mold. I literally did not set foot again in my office. I left the office, I practiced at home for a month or two, and then found a new office space and moved out. And there began my journey to become a mold expert because I had by default to fix my own body and my own mind. And that was back in the days where it was 2014 and 15. So even before you were diagnosed, and no one was talking about mold. There was like there are very few doctors who knew anything about it. And so I had to really, really dive deep and learn in order to survive and heal myself. And I learned so much because literally my life was on the line. There's a chapter in the
Yeah.
book that says, God, please don't take my brain, because I had been through a lot. I had lost all my hair with chemo. My gut was destroyed with Crohn's, but my brain started being affected by the mold. And I was like, okay, this is my organ. I really need to
Yeah.
survive. This is my life depends on it. And I remember that day when I prayed, I was like, oh my gosh, please don't take my brain, because mold absolutely affects your cognition and your mood. And no surprise, I actually went through a difficult divorce about a year after the mold. And a lot of people ask how it affects relationships. It absolutely affected my ability to show up, because it was really it's really difficult to survive when you're trying to navigate moving a practice, dealing with a mold, and your sense of overwhelm goes up. So the mold just creates much more of a you're in survival mode. And this is a whole nother topic. There's absolutely a traumatic effect on the amygdala and limbic system with mold, even as a chemical. Even if you're resourced and you have good relationships and you've done work around trauma, mold will chemically, just by inhalation, trigger the amygdala. So almost everybody I've ever seen who's had mold has to deal a little bit with the trauma response as well. But I can talk more about what you can do about mold, but that's my story as far as how I got into it and how I realized that it was a big issue for myself and many people.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I mean, if it's okay, I'm going to get a little vulnerable here just because I've sat on the other side of that as the person that wasn't dealing with it and watched it traumatize somebody, watched somebody cognitively decline, somebody I cared a lot about. Like, she was not the same person. Every single day she woke up a little bit less of herself, and 13, 14 different medicines she's shoveling down her throat. And then it's like, what the hell is going on? And then I'm researching diets. Like, how do we cure this? I stumble across Michaela Peterson, carnivore, you got to try this. And it's like, and then we get an expert out to the house to test it. And he walks in and he goes, just so you know, every house in Florida has mold. So we're going to find something here today, but it's probably not the cause of your problem. So as you said, it's such an uneducated topic, and a lot of people don't know about it. Now, you said something black toxic mold. Are there different types of mold that people can have in their house, and what are kind of the levels of those?
So great insight. And first of all, the sad thing is, if you're out there and you think you have mold or you want to look at that, you want to find a good remediator, because what you can't ran into is so, so common. I've had many patients where clinically, with their description of their symptoms, with the labs that I do, I am certain that mold is at the root. And they'll come in and say, oh, I had an inspector that said it was fine. And I'm like, try again. And I literally sometimes had 3, 4, 5 on the 5th inspection. They find a massive issue that the first 4 people. So if you're listening and you suspect mold and you say, well, I had an inspector and they said it was fine. There's different ways of testing. There's different things. That's a whole nother hour lecture. We won't go into the details, but I love that you shared that experience, because it makes you doubt yourself. You're like, well, maybe it's not that. And most of the time, mold is going to be behind a wall. It's not going to be visible. You're not going to see nasty black stuff. It's going to look okay. If you're sensitive like me, you might smell it, but otherwise you may not know at all. And the other thing about it is, a lot of the remediators are like, oh, everybody has mold. It's no big deal. But when you take an internal environment that's sealed from the world, and you have a toxin that's putting out this, basically, of mold and the spores. Spores are things they would test in air sampling. They're toxic, but you're never going to get them into your lungs. They're too big. You might breathe them, they might irritate you, they might cause allergies. But when those mold particulate is fragmented, either through remediation or opening up a cavity, those fragments are small and they can get in. And then the worst thing that's happening all the time before you ever see or know about the mold is they're producing mycotoxins. Mycotoxins, as I mentioned before, are literally 2.5 microns or smaller. They're as small as viruses, which means they go straight through the wall, straight into our alveoli when we breathe them in, into the lungs, into the bloodstream with do not pass go. There's no transport needed. So literally within 5 seconds of being in a moldy environment, I can feel the effects of my sinuses and lungs, not because those spores go into my body, because the mycotoxins the spores produce go into my body. And this is one of those big things. And there's a lot of remediators that don't understand it's not just the mold that's growing there, it's the toxins they're producing. So back to, I said black toxic because that's kind of a lay term. That's really a little, not the best terminology. I probably shouldn't have used it. There are different molds. So the common ones we see, aspergillus, penicillin, Stachybotrys, Chaetomium, Willaria. Those are some of the top 5 ones we see that require a water source. So we find the evidence in dust or evidence in air sampling or evidence of mycotoxins from those molds. We know that there is an active water source, is an active mold problem. And it's not true that everything has mold. Well, it is true in the sense that there's some outdoor molds, but when you have an outdoor environment, even if there's lots of dead leaves and debris and lots of mold, that dilutional effect of being outdoors is so great that you never get a concentrated effect of that mold and mycotoxins. In an indoor environment, number one, in the 70s, we started to put fungicides in our paint so that every time we paint the house of a new house, it has an antifungal, which kills mold. Sounds like a good idea, but it's the same concept as antibiotic resistance. All of a sudden, we create super molds and super species that are way, way more toxic because they've had that effect of that fungicide over and over again for decades. So the types of molds that now grow in homes are usually way more toxic, produce more toxic material. And some of these toxins are literally known to be neurotoxic, immunotoxic, kidney toxic, like they are known carcinogens, known toxins. There's one particular toxin we can measure in the body or in the environment called mycophenolic acid. When I had exposure, I had this one in my body, and this one is actually used by pharmaceuticals to make a drug called Cellcept. Cellcept is given to organ transplant patients so that they don't reject the organs. It basically completely suppresses their immune system. So that's how toxic these things are. And of course, they use that for the organ transplant because it's a benefit, but we can get massively ill from exposure to these molds and mycotoxins.
Yeah. So what are some preventative measures that people can take both environmentally in their homes to obviously you can't fully eliminate it, right? Like things are going to happen, but how can you create an environment in your home that is going to be the strongest against mold? And then what are some, I guess, preventative lifestyles steps that people can take?
Yeah, great. One thing is if you really do have a massive mold issue, again, say behind this wall there was leak from the roof and it got through the, in between the wall and all of a sudden there's black toxic mold growing there. No amount of dietary supplements or things are going to take away the fact that I'm keep getting exposed. So you really have to take care of the root problem. It doesn't mean you have to get rid of everything you own. It doesn't mean you have to move necessarily. So these things can absolutely be taken care of with the proper remediation, but you can't leave a big problem of mold in your home and take enough supplements or do enough detox to overcome that. So the number one step is find the root, find the problem. And if it's, say it's a drywall or any porous material, you usually have to cut out porous material and replace it. If you have a stone or concrete or wood structural beams, you can treat those things. You don't have to like tear down the house, but you really want to take care of the root and you want to have a good person to do that. Now, in addition to that, so say there's mold behind this wall, we tear out the drywall, we replace it, we treat anything that's like structure bearing, weight bearing structural pieces, and then we clean it up and treat it and paint it. Great. But then you also want to clean your home because all that mycotoxins and debris that have been being produced by the mold is in your environment. And if you just leave that in your air ducts, your HVAC system, and your sofas and your couches, you're still going to not feel well. So the second step is usually a small particulate clean, which usually involves a type of fog of some sort. You can do it yourself. They don't have to be expensive. And a deep clean where you wipe off every surface to get rid of that dust and that debris. Mold and mycotoxins ride on dust. So the number one thing you can do is fix the problem, get rid of dust. Now, we all have, we don't all have perfectly clean homes, but a clean home is one of your best protections against mold, because if you don't have a lot of dust riding around, you cannot have a lot of mold toxins or things, even pesticides and chemicals ride on dust. So taking your shoes off at the door, cleaning the dust, cleaning your HVAC system, at least after the mold remediation and then routinely, those are the kind of things that actually really make a difference. Replacing your furnace filters every 3 months, put a little tag on there, remind yourself. Those are like simple things that really do make a difference. And then environment, getting a standalone air filter that does both HEPA and VOC filtration. I have one in my bedroom. I have one in my office. Those are great. And then your own body. So if you've accumulated, like I did, some mycotoxins in the tissues from exposure, you need to work on the liver, kidney, lungs kind of access. And how we do that is anything that will enhance glutathione. Glutathione is our master antioxidant. You can take it IV, you can take it liposomally, you can take it inhaled, but getting glutathione in your body up, the level up. And what that does is it allows your body to release the toxins from the tissues that where they're stored into the bloodstream. Your liver then filters those toxins out of the bloodstream, dumps them into the bile, which is stored in the gallbladder. Bile is squeezed out into the gut, and the bile just recirculates. It's very, very efficient. So the way you get that recirculation loop to get out of your body is you use binders like clay or charcoal or glycomannan or chlorella. There's many, many natural binders out there, and those binders will actually electrostatically grab onto that bile acids and pull them out through the stool and help you eliminate the toxic load. Other things that are really critical are infrared sauna. Dry brushing is great. Hot and cold therapy, cryotherapy is great because any of those things stimulate lymphatics, stimulate your tissues to release. I'm a huge fan of Epsom salt baths. I take them every night. So those are all things you can incorporate as well.
Yeah, that's great. Big fan of infrared here. So I've done an infrared sauna every day for 30 minutes, outside of maybe 10 days in the last 4 years. Like I will move things around in my morning to make sure I get my sauna in. It's like that important to me. It's radically transformed
That's
my
amazing. And I want to
life.
say something to that because so many people go to a spa for a weekend or a 21-day January detox at the gym and they think, oh, well, I can just do that and then eat like crap or do things. And what you just described, I do the same. Like I take an Epsom salt bath every single night. I use sauna twice a week, but without fail, I have my PMF mat here, I have my red light over there, I have like all these devices. But what you want to do, you don't have to have all these devices. You don't have to have sauna every day, but you have to get a plan where you incorporate some level of detox into your daily habits, like you and I do because otherwise you're behind the game. You're in toxic soup. We're all
Yeah.
swimming where our buckets are overloaded. And nowadays, that's the moral of the story is we have to think about clean air, clean water, clean food, and some basic detox protocols because otherwise we are all going to get toxicity and we're going to develop cancer, autoimmunity, or neurodegenerative unless we're proactively doing something to decrease our load.
Yeah. Well, after having shingles, like I told you at the age of 25, and then watching, somebody I cared about a lot go through what she did, it was kind of like, hey, you're not 20 anymore, Frank. You're getting, in the second half of your 30s, going to be 40 here pretty soon. Start taking some of these preventative measures. And I was doing it before COVID. So as everybody's running around frantically concerned with, am I getting a test? Am I sick? This and that. I was like bulletproof for like 3 years. I still haven't gotten a confirmed COVID test. I may have had it for a day or two. I don't know. There was a point when I didn't feel 100%, but by 2 days later, I was back fully charged. And I believe that is probably a big part of it was that regular practice with the infrared sauna. Like I said, it's radically
I
transformed my
100%
life.
believe that was a part of it because even that
Yeah.
heat is antiviral. Like you're
Oh
automatically
God.
treating yourself. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah, it's amazing. No, I appreciate all of this. I wanna finish here with your book, Unexpected. So you have a book that's coming out here this week in a few days called Unexpected: Finding Resilience Through Functional Medicine, Science, and Faith. We've talked a lot about functional medicine. We talked a lot about science. You've thrown a lot of words at me that I don't fully understand. I have an entire page of words I need to go research so that I can understand everything you taught me here today. I'm curious why you included faith in a book about science and functional medicine, and what role has your faith played in your life and in your recovery and overcoming all these diseases?
Yes, and interesting because I knew I was going right into controversy by including that word, right? But what I found is I definitely have a deep faith, a strong belief in the divine and in God, and that's been such an important part of my life and recovery because it allows me to frame things in a way that I see that it's part of the title Unexpected. When I'm looking for something beautiful in the midst of suffering and difficulty and knowing there's meaning and purpose even in the most difficult parts of life, that to me is part of the faith and part of the belief that something better is available on the other side of this. And and everyone listening, you guys all have suffering difficulties. I am not unique in this. And we've all been through difficult times. And in the midst of them, it sucks. It's not fun. I don't wish it on my worst enemies. But if we can have a framework, a mindset of looking for the lesson, the teaching, and the way to transform our bodies, minds, and souls in the journey, it changes everything. It gives us like, I know now, part of resilience is that I know I've been through a lot and I hope I don't have to go through a lot more. But if I do, I now know there's nothing that could come against me that I couldn't figure out or overcome, even death. I start the book by talking about a beautiful 22-year-old girl that came to see me. And she was so sick with Lyme and mast cell activation. And she was so far gone that I saw her for several months and she passed away. But you know what I did? I remember that visit so well, like it was yesterday. I sat with her and I said, I looked at her form because I never talk about faith unless the patient brings it up and they're okay with it. But she had written on her form, my faith in God is one of the most important things to me. So I thought, okay, what do we have to lose? And I said, you said your faith in God is important. Could I pray with you? And I just prayed that maybe something greater could come of her life through this intense, difficult thing, and that God would give her peace and relieve her suffering. And she went on to create a foundation for other people like herself. It's literally out there giving thousands and thousands of dollars to people to prevent the suffering, to help early diagnosis. She allowed her journey, allowed her mother to write a memoir. And there's been such an effect of her life and her passion to transform and help people that were suffering like her before she died. And so I realized there's even greater things beyond our life. And the truth is, I'm a physician, and a healer, but everybody's terminal, right? So if we don't have some greater meaning and purpose, now, anyone listening, you might be like, I'm atheist, I don't believe in God. That's okay. But the thing that I always say about this faith is, faith to me is, how do we deal with the inevitable uncertainty of life? We all have these control things like insurance policies, or like things that we think we're in control, or that we have protection. And the truth is, we are not guaranteed another breath or another day. And if we don't have a greater, like some reason we get up in the day, and the studies have shown having a meaning and purpose is something greater than ourselves, is so key to a lifelong happiness, joy, satisfaction, and even our physical health. So I am passionate about bringing, and not my perspective or my faith, but the idea that something greater can really transform our lives and allow us to live in such a different level, even despite suffering. That's my passion and purpose. And that's why I had to include it in the book.
I love that. I love that so much, Dr. Jill. Thank you. Absolutely beautiful story there. And I didn't ask the question around a controversial way, like, and I hope it didn't
No,
didn't
not
come
at all.
across
I just
that.
want to be sure
Um,
listeners didn't think that I was trying to, like, nowadays it's so, I love everyone wherever they're at. And I think it's important to frame it in whatever view that you bring to the world, but knowing that the science supports us. The
yeah,
science supports this, right? For health
uh,
and happiness.
100%. No, we've had Dr. Caroline Leaf on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her
Yes.
work, cleaning
Yeah.
out your mental mess, deep in the neuroscience world. Like, she's talked openly about her faith. I had Anna Lemke on from Stanford, author of Dopamine Nation. And Anna shares a story in her book where she was working with a guy that was struggling with a sex addiction. And she had thrown everything. I mean, literally everything at this guy. And he's trying it and he keeps failing, keeps returning back. She shared the story in her book, and I asked her about it on the podcast. She said she reached a certain point where she had to take her science hat off. She just told the guy to pray. And I asked her, like, what was she seeking in the prayer that she wasn't able to get through science? And she articulated exactly the way that you did. Sometimes we need to get out of our own way and realize that we're not in control of any of this. Like, there's something way beyond our ability to fully understand and articulate that is controlling so much of this world and so much of the reality that we're seeing. So I appreciate so much of you sharing that and making it a big part of your work. I think it's incredible when you can bridge the gap between the two, because I don't think you would have science without faith. Like, you have to, like, if you're pursuing science to find something, you have to have faith that there's going to be something for you to
Right.
find
Doesn't
on
mean
the
it's
other
like
side of
it's
it.
integral of both to have both together. And I always think
Yeah.
about like left brain, right brain, science and faith, these things. We have to have
Mm,
the
yes.
immersion of both of them together.
Yeah, I love that. Love that so much. Talk a little bit about trauma, because I know it's a big part of your story. There's a lot of stories in the book as well. What role can maybe somebody holding on to their trauma, not fully healing from it, is there a way that prevents them from fully healing from some of these diseases?
Oh gosh, and I think it's so relevant to your work as well with men and addictions, because one of the things I think that's the most powerful in healing is, first of all, many people have trauma, if not all of us have some sort, and it could be little t, like, small things of family history or family of origin, or it could be some really, really awful big T trauma. We have that, and yet we don't have to identify, and that doesn't have to become us. And the relevant point here is how we identify ourselves. Like, I was doing a podcast earlier today, and we talked about, I sometimes now, I've been 20 years cancer free. Someone will ask me about cancer, and I almost forget that I had cancer. Like, it's so weird in my mind because I'm like, oh yeah, I did have cancer. But I am so not identified as a cancer patient, a cancer survivor. And it never was my identity. And I believe part of the healing comes when we don't identify with a victim mindset. And I'm not minimizing the trauma and the difficulty people have gone through, or the illness, and I myself have gone through on all levels. But what I've never done is made that who I am. Because if our identity is, no, I'm resilient, I'm a survivor, I am going to be able to overcome. And like I told you a minute ago, I know in myself, my resilience comes from the fact of, number one, I have faith. Number two, I know I can figure things out. And number three, I know anything that comes, I'm going to have the tools and abilities and resources to figure it out. Marie Forleo says, I have a little thing here, everything is figure outable. So I have this because this is so great. This is my life. We can figure it out as long as we have that mindset. And what bottom line there is we don't have to identify with these illnesses or things that happen to us. And when we change our identity, the habits go along with it. Because if we're like, I'm a healthy person, I don't eat junk food, there's no thought about eating junk food. We just know our identity. I don't smoke. I don't view pornography. If we just have this identity thing, then all of a sudden those things that we were trying to overcome become easier because we become a new person. It's not a habit.
I love that so much. One of the things that I almost said I've become famous for saying, I'm definitely not famous, but something I try to get across to everybody that I have an opportunity to work with or talk to is in my opinion, all successful transformation is rooted in an identity change first. All successful transformation, whether you're transforming your body physically, you need to step into a new identity. Person that no longer eats the junk food. Whether you're overcoming an addiction, right? You need to step into the identity of somebody that's no longer addicted and held captive to these vices or these behaviors. If you're healing from trauma, or you're healing from disease or illness, you must begin to embrace the identity of the person that no longer is the victim to any of that. So I love that so much. Tell people what they can expect in Unexpected, like
Yeah,
just kind of, maybe the 60-second elevator
sure.
pitch here on the book, and then where they can find it, and then we'll kind of bring today to a close.
So I got really raw and vulnerable about all of my overcoming and all that I've learned. And my whole hope there is I'm telling my story. I hope it's engaging and inspiring for you to have on your own journey. What I want you to do as a reader is see yourself. It's not really about me. It's about you transforming your own life. And my greatest desire and joy with this project is that it would transform every single reader in some way, in some different way. And what I did in the sidebars is give you practical advice. So you have the story and hopefully transformationally so to give you hope and encouragement along the way. And then all the practical stuff, like what tests to do, how do you find mold in your home? What do you do if you have mold? Like all the practical stuff is there. And that is my goal and desire in this book. And you can find everything at readunexpected.com. That's the landing site. I've got lots of free gifts there if you want to pick them up too. And I just hope it really impacts your lives.
Incredible. Yeah. And the book is going to be available. I know it's available for pre-order now. We're airing on the
March
23rd. So it's
28th
going to be
is, yep.
March
So
20.
March 28th
Yeah.
is the date. You can pre-order or you can get it after that date. And yeah, go grab all the freebies there too that I put in.
Yeah, guys, we'll link all that down in the show notes, a link to the book, to link to all of Dr. Jill's socials. Very active on Instagram. Definitely recommend giving her a follow. Very active on YouTube as well. And you have an amazing podcast where you interview guests from all different walks of life. That was one of the things I noticed, like as I was researching you, I was like, oh, we've had cute Blackson on talking about trauma. Like we've
Yeah,
had a lot of the same,
same.
yeah, we had a lot of the same guests. So
Uh,
it's amazing. So we'll get
cool.
all of her information there plugged down in the show notes for you guys. Dr. Jill, this has been absolutely incredible. Such a wealth of knowledge. Like I said, I feel stupid for not understanding some of these words, but it's been an incredible education, and I'm just so grateful and appreciative for you, your vulnerability, sharing your story, but really making your life's struggles and journeys and test like become your life's purpose now. Like I think it's absolutely incredible what you're doing. So we like to end every episode here with the same question. So Dr. Joe, obviously the title of the show is called The Superhuman Life. For me, when I talk about living a superhuman life, it's really a belief system. It's how I try to show up in the world every single day. And as we've discussed, I'm a man of faith. So I do believe that we're placed here with a purpose and calling on our life. So every listener, every person watching this right now is here for a purpose. But knowing and accepting that there's a purpose for your life, I don't believe is enough. I think we need to be very intentional about our growth, about our development, and how we bring that purpose to the world. So that's how I kind of frame and describe living a superhuman life. But Dr. Jill Carnahan, as we end today's conversation, how would you define living a superhuman life?
Um, so every one of us has had times where we wonder, are we worthy of love? Are we enough? Are we doing enough? Are we being enough? And part of that answer comes in this question that also comes up, are we worthy of love? What I found to be the most powerful healer and goal in my life is not how do I receive love, but how do I embody and become love to the world? And there is no more powerful inspiration or healing than showing up in the world. And you know what happens? It's magic. It's not magic, but you get the most love you get from friends and family. I have so much love in my life, and I'm not asking for that. All I'm doing is every day waking up saying, God, how can I be a greater force of love in the world? And that right there is the magic behind all the healing that I've experienced.
Incredible, Dr. Jill. So beautiful. You are a gift, and we are all better today because of you. So grateful for you, grateful for your work. Guys, listen once, listen twice, share this one. I hope you brought the notes. But guys, thank you so much for tuning in today, for getting value out of these episodes. I know I ask you guys every single week take a few seconds and get back, because your time of telling Apple, telling Spotify that this show is valuable will get us in front of more people. And we need to get this conversation in front of as many people as possible. So if you haven't done so yet, 5-star rating, written review. But more importantly, if somebody is struggling with some mold toxicities, maybe there's somebody in your life that's got some autoimmune, maybe there's some people that you've seen their mental health decline over these last couple of years, do us a favor, but do them a blessing by sharing today's conversation with them. But for Dr. Jill Carnahan, Frank Rich, your host here at The Super in Life, we love you guys. We'll see you next week.